When I was about 8 years old, I remember that I took a train one time with my older sister. She would have been 15, I think, and we were going to visit our grandparents. It was just us two, and we were just going for the weekend. Our grandparents lived a few hours away, but there was a train route that went from our city to theirs. My sister and I liked trains, so we wanted to take the train there, and our parents agreed. I remember that we first got to the train station in our city, and it was pretty busy there. Soon we boarded the train and got into our seats. The ride was pretty smooth, and we sat by the windows and watched things go by. I would say that the train was almost completely full with passengers. When we arrived in our grandparents' city, we got off the train along with most of the other people. Some of them were staying to go to the next stop though. So my sister and I walked into the train station, and I guess our grandparents were not there yet to pick us up. As we waited, my sister said that she was going to use the restroom. I didn't have to go, so my sister walked off and I kept standing there. I looked around the station, and it was very busy with lots of other people around. After about 2 minutes or so, I remembered that this woman approached me. I didn't know who she was, but she pointed out to the train and said that my sister was boarding it. I figured that we had to go back on the train and this wasn't our stop, so I started to walk over. The woman then went with me to the train, and we both started to get back on. Now, to this point, I had just kind of been following my sister. I was young, and I didn't know exactly which stop was ours or which city we were even in. I just figured that I hadn't seen my sister after she had come out of the bathroom. So I actually got back onto the train and then went back to my seat, but I didn't see my sister there. I was confused, so at that point, I started looking around the train, thinking maybe she switched seats. The woman who was with me was sitting in the next row over. I didn't ask her where exactly my sister had gone or anything. Instead, I was just silently looking around. After about a minute, I actually saw my sister. She was walking just outside of the station and seemed to be looking around, probably for me. I got up and started to walk for the doors of the train. When I stood, the woman also stood up and asked me where I was going. I told her that my sister was not on the train, and I started walking away. The woman did not say anything back to me. She also didn't go after me or anything. I left the train and then walked over to my sister. I was very confused at this point, but when I reached my sister, she asked me what on earth I was doing back on the train. I told her how the lady told me she had been on, and I figured that we had to take the train to another city. My sister told me that we were in the city that our grandparents lived in, and she didn't know what that lady was talking about. I realized at that point that I may have avoided something bad. The train left a very short time after that, and we got picked up by my grandparents. Looking back at that, I'm really glad that I saw my sister and got off the train when I did. I live in a very large city, and I take the subway to and from work every day. It's part of my routine, and usually it goes just fine. Over the years, I've seen some pretty interesting people on the subway. There's also some sketchy people from time to time as well. So one night, when I was taking the subway back after work, I didn't bat an eye after seeing a guy wearing a ski mask. It was later, and the train was not packed, but there were several other people riding it. This guy was sitting across from me and a little ways down. He wore all black clothing, from his shoes to his sweatshirt, and he even wore gloves. The strangest part was that the ski mask was completely covering his face along with sunglasses. I couldn't tell you anything about what the guy looked like underneath. He seemed to be slightly tall and have a slightly muscular build, but overall, I didn't really give him much thought. I was pretty much on my phone mostly, just looking around on various apps like I usually did. After riding the subway for a while, it was soon time for my stop. I must have been a little bit distracted though, because I almost missed it. I remember the car stopping, and I figured that it was the stop before mine, so I didn't even bother to look up. But then I realized that I might be mistaken, and I did look up to see that it was in fact my stop. I quickly stood up and then headed for the doors before they closed and the car would take off again. Luckily, I was able to make it, but as I was walking to the door, I remember noticing the masked man getting up as well, like right after me. This was a little bit suspicious. In the moment though, I was too focused on making it out of the doors. After I left the subway car, the man left shortly after me. I started walking through the station to then go upstairs. There were a few people outside walking, but really not that many. I soon walked up the stairs and then went out of the subway station. Now I was on the sidewalks of the city at night, and there were less people around. But within a short time, I noticed that the masked man was walking a little ways behind me. I was now pretty concerned that he was following me for some reason. I didn't know why he would be, but it sure seemed a lot like he was. So I kept going, and I turned where I usually did. When the guy behind me also turned, I knew that I had to do something. I was about 5 minutes of a walk from my apartment, and I knew this part of the city like the back of my hand. I got to another straight part in the sidewalk, and the guy was still behind me. He was trailing me by roughly 40 feet or so he was not right behind me or anything. There was this shop that I knew was still open, and when I reached it, I went inside. It was a deli, and they had a door in the back that not everybody knew about, but I had gone there quite a few times. I walked straight for the back, and as I was rounding the corner towards the door, I looked behind me and saw the guy entering. I quickly went out of his sight, found the back door, and went out of it into an alley. When I got into the alley, I literally ran for the street and was able to make it. I walked the rest of the way back home without seeing the guy. I'm fairly certain that he was following me. I'm not sure why, but I'm glad that I didn't have to find out. Since then, I haven't seen him, and I haven't had any more creepy things happen to me on the subway. This happened when I was younger. I was probably about 12 or 13 when this event took place. We lived a little bit out in the country. There was a nice and quiet neighborhood that my family lived in, and I enjoyed it. There was a group of neighborhood kids who I would hang out with, especially in the summertime. We would all hang out and play sports and stuff in this one field near our houses. The field was next to the road leading into our neighborhood, and I have no clue who actually owned the land. There were no houses that close to it, and it was pretty open. Running alongside the field were these old train tracks that curved away at the end of the field, and also at the end of it was a large woods. On the other side of that woods were more houses. The train tracks and road were both typically very quiet. So one evening, a group of us kids were out there playing kickball. It started with probably 7 or 8 of us, but as it got later and dark out, it went down to 4 of us still out there. We continued to play outside, and it was soon completely dark. I figured that I should head back home pretty soon, but we were having a fun time. That's when we heard a train approaching. The tracks were pretty far from where we were, so we were not in any kind of danger or anything. It was very unusual for a train to come through though. It would only seem to happen once every couple of months if I remember correctly. So the train started going by pretty slowly, and all of us stopped and watched it. It went right past the field, and then it started to go around the corner through the woods. There were quite a few train cars on it, and it continued to go, but it got slower. I remember that we finally saw the end, but on one of the last train cars, we saw something else. This was not a train with passengers, but the kind that probably just had materials or whatever on it. But one of the last cars had a door on it that was open, and we saw this guy standing there looking out of it. He looked at us as it went past, and I just stared at him, surprised at the sight. But the train kept going slower and slower. When the caboose almost got into the woods and the man was just barely in our sight still, the train stopped completely. We were still just watching it. After it stopped for like 10 seconds, the man hopped off the train. He was really far away, but we all saw him. The guy was kind of heading towards the woods. I remember thinking that I wanted to go home at that point. We decided to wrap up our game of kickball. Instead of just leaving though, we decided to all get one more kick each. So I was the first one to kick, and the other guys were out in the field. After I kicked, I went out into the field. When the last friend was kicking before we left, he kicked it really far over all our heads. I was the farthest back, and I went running after it. The ball did not make it to the woods, but maybe within 20 feet of it. I remember that as I was grabbing the ball, I heard some leaves rustling in the woods. I picked up the ball and then just sprinted back over to my friends. When I got back, I turned around to look. I saw the man emerging from the woods. He was walking through the field now, in our direction. The guy had long hair and a beard. None of us recognized him, but we all just took off running. We went out of the field, down the road, and back into our neighborhood. Then we scattered, each going to our separate houses. We were all able to make it back safely. I don't think the guy even chased after us, but that was a terrifying moment. I don't know why the guy was on the train or why he jumped off of it. I also don't know why he came out of the woods towards us. I tried not to stay out after dark after that though. This is a crazy experience that I had while I was visiting New York a few years ago. I went to New York City, and this was my second time being there. Obviously, there's a lot of things to do and see there. I didn't have a car with me, so I would be either walking or taking the subway to travel places, and I was traveling by myself, which I really didn't mind. But one night, I was going home after lots of sightseeing in one part of the city. I was taking the subway back to my hotel. So I got on and sat down, and after a few stops, I remember this one guy got on and sat next to me. He was a sort of big guy, probably in his 40s, with light brown hair. The subway was pretty crowded, so it wasn't weird or anything of him to sit next to me. I remember that he started a conversation with me, and he seemed like a pretty friendly guy. He was talking about the city and said that he lived and worked there. He asked me a few things about myself as well. So we talked on and off for probably 10 or 15 minutes. Then it was my stop, and I said bye to the man and got up and left the subway. I walked out and up to the sidewalk, and then was just a couple of blocks from my hotel. But after getting onto the sidewalk, I remember realizing that I didn't have my wallet. I always kept my wallet in my right pocket, and I realized that there was nothing there. I felt around all my pockets, and it definitely was not in any of them. I started looking around the sidewalks, but I didn't see anything. I realized that I must have left it on the subway. I never took it out of my pocket, but possibly it had fallen out, or else the guy that was sitting next to me could have stole it from me, and he was sitting just to my right and pretty close to me. I wanted to go back on the subway, but it was long gone now. I was really angry because I had all my credit cards and stuff in there. Plus, I had over $100 in cash. I figured I had better put a freeze on my cards, so I walked up to my hotel and went in my room. Then I went online and turned off all my credit cards, which luckily hadn't been used yet. I was trying to figure out what I was going to do because I had to go back in 2 days and I didn't have my license or anything now. After doing research online and talking to a few friends for probably almost an hour, there was suddenly a knock at my hotel room door. I got up and walked over to the door. I looked through the peephole, but nobody was there, so I opened it up and looked around. I still saw no one, but then I looked down and saw my wallet right there on the floor in front of my door. I couldn't believe my eyes. I picked it up and took it in the room. My license as well as all my credit cards were still there. However, all the cash was gone, which did not really surprise me. I was mostly just happy to get it back. I didn't know how anybody would know to give it to me though. I figured maybe it was the guy that I sat next to. So I left my room and went down to the front desk. I asked them if they had brought my wallet up to me, but they said no. This shocked me. I was sure that somebody who worked at the hotel had brought it up, because how else would they know where my room was? The only other explanation that I could think of was if the man that was sitting next to me brought it up himself. But how would he know which room was mine? I talked to several hotel staff, and they all denied knowing about my wallet or bringing it to my room. It's still a mystery to me to this day. I think maybe the guy followed me, but I'm not sure. I found out later that night that somebody had tried to use my credit card at an ATM around the corner shortly before it was at my door, but it declined. I'm glad that I disabled my cards when I did. I used to live in a major city and would ride the subway all the time. I didn't really mind it too much, but I have a car now and live outside the city, and I like it much better. But back to when I would ride the subway, I had this one really strange experience. So one night I was riding back rather late. It was probably close to midnight, and I was tired and on my way home. There were a few people on the subway as well, including somebody sitting a little to my left and someone across from me. There was another guy sort of across from me, but a ways down to my right. I remember that sometime on the ride, the guy across from me and a little ways to the right took out this camera. He started seemingly taking pictures of me. At first, I did not think that he was taking pictures of me, but maybe the guy sitting next to me. But as I looked over at him and he kept going, it sure seemed like he was directly pointing the camera at me specifically. I had no idea why he would be doing this. It seemed pretty strange. I didn't confront him though, and instead just ignored it. I looked down and went on my phone. However, a couple more times during the ride I looked up, and he was still taking pictures of me. Soon though, it was my stop. I was glad to get off the subway and away from this guy, but when I left the subway, he did too. I had a bad feeling when I saw him leaving, still holding the camera. As I walked away, I glanced back and saw him still pointing the camera at me to take another picture. This was kind of annoying to me now. I walked out of the subway and left, and was now going down the street. I thought for a moment that the guy had gone in another direction, but I was wrong. I looked around and soon saw him still taking pictures of me. After walking a little ways down with the man still there, I stopped and decided to confront him. When I turned around, he was still pointing the camera at me. I took a couple of steps toward him and started to ask him what he was doing. When I did though, he just turned around and bolted. He ran extremely fast off in the other direction, and I saw him go completely out of my sight. It was really strange, but I was glad that he was gone. So at that point, I just walked the rest of the way back home to my apartment. I got back and went inside. Well, I remember that maybe an hour after getting home, I randomly looked out of my window. I had a window that looked out to the street, and there was a sidewalk below me. I would look outside all the time because it was a cool view of the city like that. I was on the 3rd floor, and I saw the guy with the camera. He was standing out on the sidewalk, looking up at me. He still had his camera and then pointed it at me when I saw him. As soon as I noticed him though, I went away from the window and then covered it with the shades. I couldn't believe how he had somehow found me. He had gone so far away from me that I didn't think he'd have time to catch up or know my route, and I hadn't noticed him following me. But it made me worried that he already knew where I lived or had followed me before or something. I looked out a while later and he was gone, and after that, I never saw him again. I still don't know how he found me though. It was the craziest thing.